Hey, it's Paulie. Thanks for joining me for the second half of my conversation with former Buzzcocks drummer John Maher. In part one, we got into his early days with Buzzcocks, some of the upcoming vinyl reissues on Domino Records, and the Pete Shelley Memorial Concert that is scheduled for London's Royal Albert Hall on June 21st. So if you missed part one, check that out. We go a little bit longer in part two, talking about drag racing and Volkswagens and what John's website refers to as an alternative view of the Outer Hebrides. Be sure to check out John Maher, that's maher.co.uk, for some of these amazing long exposure night photographs and his abandoned photography in the Outer Hebrides. Amazing stuff. But we pick up where we left off, on tour with Blondie and under the influence of Clem Burke. Buzzcocks got to do at least one tour with Blondie, right?
We did, yeah. That was incredible because I was a big Blondie fan, right? Really, from the first time I heard. I think it was when Ex-Offender was released as a single, and it got played on the John Peel program. And because I was kind of into the Ronettes and Shangri-La sort of stuff then as beforehand, and then this was kind of like this amazing mix of had something of that type of music to it, but it had that energy and kind of exactly punky, I wouldn't say, but it had that kind of energy to it. Plus, as soon as you heard the drumming, I just knew anything that had drums in it, I was listening to it anyway. And then when I heard his playing on such a great song, it was like just a winner. And then you actually, because this is very much pre-internet, so the availability of information on bands and stuff, you were relying purely on the weekly music papers, or maybe a song had come up on the radio and stuff. So, huge fan. And then, let me see, going forward it'll be into 1978, we got word that we would do 4 gigs supporting Blondie in Europe. I think three of the gigs were in Holland, 1 was in Belgium. And that was also going to be, I think that was pretty much my first time ever to go outside the UK. We'd been on holiday to Ireland a couple of times with my parents, but I'd never been anywhere in Europe. And plus the fact that I knew I was going to meet Clem Burke and obviously Debbie Harry and so on. It was just and I was only 18 at the time, it was amazing. It was going from literally having the poster of Debbie on the back of my bedroom door in my parents' house to 2 years later going on doing a short tour with them in Europe. Absolutely incredible.
Now, talking about going on tour and, coming to the States for the first time, and I was seeing those photos on your Instagram from New York City. Had you already taken up photography at that time? Do you have other photos that are in the archives, so to speak, of those early tour days? Did you do any band photography, any live music photography, anything of that sort?
No. In fact, I didn't. I'd never owned my own camera until just before we went on that first trip to America, and I decided that I needed to take a camera with me so I could, take some shots of the place. And the camera that was advertised very, very heavily on TV at the time, I don't know if it was the same in America, but they had this very strong marketing campaign for the Olympus trip, which was David Bailey was the main guy that was promoting the camera. And of course, I guess I fell for the advertising, and the cost, it fell within what I could just about afford. And it was a very easy camera to use, kind of pretty much point and shoot, but with a roll of film in the back instead of being digital, of course. And that's what it was that upcoming first visit to America that prompted me to buy the camera and start wandering around taking shots.
Again, I'm amazed, too, how quickly you picked it up, because you must have been like 19 or 20 at the time. And looking back at those photos, you've got a very keen eye of what we know nowadays as street photography, and lots of photos of the early American cars and stuff. And that seems to be something that preoccupied your lens in those days.
Yeah, well, I was See, a kid, teenager, growing up in Manchester, I know I was quite into saw a lot of American films in that era. It probably coincided. I think probably when I was around about 14, 15, I sort of got very interested in going to the cinema, and a lot of the films that I was watching were, well, you had things like Serpico, Taxi Driver, Mean Streets, lots of New York, French Connection, all these classic 70s films that were set in New York. So you had this feeling of almost like you felt familiar. Although you'd never ever been to America, there's this feeling of familiarity because you've seen it so often in the films or on TV. I mean, I remember watching TV detective series, like Kojak or something. I'm pretty sure that was New York based or somewhere like that. So you just something that really struck me when we first arrived and we got off the plane at JFK. And you walked outside, and I probably took several pictures of those yellow sort of retro-looking checker cabs. Thinking, right. Wow, look, there's I've got to get one quick before very soon realising that they're absolutely all over the place. This is not a rare vehicle; they're absolutely everywhere. And also on the car front, for some reason, I was very big into particularly 1950s American cars before we went over on that trip. And you would go to the occasional car show over here in the UK and you might see one or two. You might see a 1957 Chevy or something like that. So when you're actually over there and you're seeing lots of this stuff, they seem to look cooler when they're in America than they do at a car show somewhere in England. So that's why, like you said on that Instagram thing, I just ended up bombing over anything that I thought was a half-decent shot that I could find from that original trip of American cars. I was sticking them on there, and I actually see. I'm sort of sorry that I didn't take more pictures of the band. It's mostly of vehicles, as you say, rather than people. Although fortunately there are a few people shots in there as well.
I don't think I could have resisted the opportunity to get in front of Debbie Harry with the camera too, for sure.
Well, fortunately, our road manager at the time, Pete Monks, I think it was the last night of that. Because we only did the 4 gigs. Well, anyway, one of those shows, he was there and told him to get his camera out and take a few shots. So I have got that classic picture of me and Debbie with our arms around each other, which makes a lot of people at my age very envious.
So you grew up in the UK with that fascination for the big block 1950s American cars, and I don't think a lot of Americans in particular realize that after your Buzzcocks career, you went on to learn auto mechanics, and you've become quite the sought-after mechanic and engineer and drag racer for Volkswagens. Why Volkswagen? That's a big turn from the big American engines.
Well, I'm not sure really. My first ever car was something that my dad bought me when I was 17. Just as soon, that's the earliest you can legally drive in the UK. So he bought me a cheap little, I think called an Austin 1100, which probably means nothing to anybody in America. It was a fairly mundane little car in the UK. And I drive it. It was a tool for getting me from A to B. It did that okay, but I had no enthusiasm for it. I probably didn't even know how to, release the engine, the bonnet, or the hood, as you call it in America. Yeah. And then it came the time to, that needed to be replaced, and I'd actually got £1,000 payment from the sales of Spiral Scratch. And I was looking around for a car, and it had to fit within that budget. And I wasn't after anything in particular. Just total coincidence, I ended up buying a Volkswagen Beetle. Now, something about the Volkswagen Beetle made me get very interested in the workings of the engine and There's an absolutely fantastic manual written for the Volkswagen Beetle by an American guy. It's a very hippie sort of way it's written. How to keep your Volkswagen alive, a guide for the complete idiot. And it had these really cool Robert Crumb style drawings in it that explained how to do pretty much everything to keep that Volkswagen on the road. And I just really totally got into it. I ended up doing my first engine build with that book by my side. One thing led to another, the obsession with the whole Volkswagen thing, and then buying I'm pretty sure it's still around, an American monthly magazine called Hot VWs, which featured all these really cool hot-rodded VWs. And that was like, to a little band of people in the UK, that magazine was the holy grail. We were getting that imported in every month and devouring everything that was in there. And then this seemed, in a way, it was a little, I suppose you might equate it to a little bit like the early days of punk in the UK. You know, there's a little band of people that were getting into this hot rod Volkswagen scene. And then in 1987, somebody had this bright idea that they would put on a Volkswagen-only drag race at the UK's main drag strip, and it got advertised in the UK car mags and everything, and it was, I think, about 30,000 people went. It was absolutely crazy. It was like there'd never been a car show, a Volkswagen car show like that before. And I was at that first one, and there were about 4 or 5 cars racing down the drag strip. Nothing particularly fast, but something about that. I said, right, if this event's on this time next year, I'm coming back with a race car. And that's what I did.
Fantastic. Are you kind of responsible for bringing drag racing to the Outer Hebrides? And that's something I meant to ask you, too. We just kind of jumped in and started talking. Where are you now? Are you still living on the Isle of Harris in the Hebrides? Or
Yeah, I'm on the Isle of Harris right now, but lived here since 2002. But as for, no, I can't claim I'm responsible at all for bringing drag racing to the Outer Hebrides. That was kind of weird. I was sat here, right where I'm sat now, in my little office in my workshop, and I was reading the local weekly paper one lunchtime, and I flipped over the page, and then there's this sort of half-page thing about drag racing is coming to Stornoway at the airport. And I literally did like a double take, thinking, wow, where did this come from? So I thought, obviously, got to go up there and see what's happening. And it was it was an amazing event, actually, because it was, it made me realise, like, well, I didn't realise there were this many youngish people on the island. You know, they seemed to have all congregated down at the airport on a Saturday evening. They weren't allowed to use the road. It wasn't actually on the airport runway. It's on what they call a service road that runs alongside the runway, and they were not allowed access to that until the last flight of the day had gone. It was set up some plastic fencing alongside the track. It was probably a health and safety potential disaster. They were using an air horn to set the cars off from the start line. One of the local police was there with their radar thing to record the speeds. It was so basic, but everybody absolutely loved it. It must have been a little bit like, you know, a 1960s drag race somewhere out in the sticks in America. You know, it had that kind of feel to it. And then, of course, I got in touch with the car club guys that had organised it, and they were talking about buying some timing equipment so that the next time they had one, they could do it a little bit more professionally. And they were looking at buying some ski timing equipment for some reason. It was really expensive. Tag Heuer for doing downhill ski timing, and so I put them in touch with a company that do actual drag race timing gear, and which was, believe it or not, it was actually less expensive and much more suited to the job. And they got funding together and they bought it. And so the next drag race, they were there, and I ended up for a few drag races. I was like the time keeper, you know, setting the cars up on the line and looking after the time slips and everything. So drag racing actually came to the Outer Hebrides, and they're holding a drag race in a few weeks still at the airport. So it's become an annual fixture.
That brings me to how I found you. I was a ham radio nerd when I was a kid, and I would scour over maps of the Outer Hebrides and other unusual places and just wonder what's going on there. And I just got it in my mind to research some other abandoned locations on obscure islands, kind of like my situation. I live on St. Simon's Island in Georgia, and we have the disappearing Gullah community and their abandoned properties in this area. I was just taking a look around to see what else was out there. I come across these amazing pictures, and it's one of my favorite musicians from one of my favorite bands. That kind of blew me away.
Yeah, well, the photography thing is, you see, when I moved up here, that was back in 2002. I've obviously been up many times on holiday and always with a camera, wandering around, taking pictures, but nothing that I would call, particularly artistic, just the usual stuff. And I had this idea that when I moved up here, I would have plenty of opportunity to wait for the right light. I would be here whenever, I could go out whenever, and I could get those ideal shots that you want to get. But actually, in fact, the camera that I moved up here with, I've still got, and it's still got the same roll of film in there that was in it when I moved up here, because I never actually got to use it. Didn't feel sufficiently inspired or whatever, and it wasn't until when would it be? It'd be 2009, and I saw a TV documentary that featured an American photographer that was doing long exposure night photography, and you may know of him, Troy Paver. He's based over, I think he's in San Francisco, but he does a lot of abandoned places. He uses a lot of, basically uses coloured light added into all his pictures, and I was kind of started off copying that, if you like. But what it was for me, it was that when I first saw some of his images, it was a bit of a like, wow, I like that, what that looks like. But the thing is, I have absolutely no idea how he was doing it. And it was seeing his pictures that inspired me to, like, I'm going to find out how he does that, and I'm going to, like, try and do something along those lines. And I kind of deviated away from that. I don't want to be a copycat, but that was the inspiration. And it was sort of like, I hadn't, as I say, I had no idea how he did it, but I thought, well, he's doing it, and he's been good enough to publish some information that sort of explains what he's up to, so it gives you a good head start to dive in and learn. And of course, when you are doing very long exposures at night time, you're just completely out of the realms of using the normal settings on the camera. It forces you really you're using all the manual controls, and if you want to get any half decent results, you're going to have to learn how to use them. So again, that was a little bit of a baptism of fire, really. You just drop in at the deep end and like, I've got to work out how this is done and how I can come up with results that I like. And it was the first time with a camera, really, where I would occasionally take a shot, and I'd think, that's the sort of thing I would actually, if I turn over a page in a magazine, that would stop me for a few seconds at least before I turn over and carry on. And that's the sort of pictures that I wanted to take.
I saw you mention in another interview that there was really only a handful of days of the year that you can execute this kind of photography because of the moonlight situation, and you're in a northern latitude where I think this time of year you've got light long into the evening.
This time of year, I mean, doing that particular style of long exposure moonlit photography, you just can't do it because it doesn't get dark enough. So really, your operating season for that would be, you could start in September just about, and through to March, possibly April. That's okay. And then you're doing it around the full moon, and the full. I got so obsessed with this at the time. If moon would need to be at least 95% full to get that real nice light lit look from the image. But if it's super cloudy or the moon is obscured in any way, then you don't get the quality of light. And you're probably talking about 3 days a month out of 5 months in the year when you could do it. And if you limit yourself, if you're really getting into photography like I was and that's how I got into it, that is incredibly frustrating. If the month, the full moon's coming, and you're getting all hyped up about it, and then the weather's awful, and it's like, I can't actually get out this month. I'm going to have to hope that it's okay next month. And that really is what I got so into photography that I was looking for other opportunities to use the camera, and that's kind of when I stumbled into going in. Well, one night when I went inside one of those houses and saw what was lying around, and then I came back in the daytime, and suddenly this opened up a new avenue. I can actually go out during daylight hours now, and the only thing is that I ended up getting obsessed about trying to find houses that had interesting content left in them, because I think say, for instance, if I go along to, people have told me about, there's a huge house that was built on an island just south of me, which has been derelict for many, many years, and there's really nothing left of it. So when I go in there, there's no personal belongings left. There's nothing sort of really tells me anything about the people who live there. So I'm not really interested in it. So those houses that I have photographed, those interior shots, generally speaking, there's signs of dereliction, but also evidence of people that have lived there, or just in the choice of furnishings or things that they've left behind. It was that element of it that got me interested.